Okay, if you could please take your seats as we welcome Ross Mcfarlane from the National Mallee Fowl Recovery Team. Gee, this team are a powerhouse, aren't they? And he's here virtually on two of our screens to the side of me to talk about the Mallee fowl and the human factor, the place the icon species in research and conservation. Can we all please welcome Ross?
Thank you, Shona. I hope I've got that right, Shona. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this session. So as you've just heard, I'm Ross Macfarlane. I've recently taken on the role as the head or the chair of the National Mallee Fowl Recovery Team in 2021. I'm privileged to be here today in that role, but I'm privileged also to have been able to spend a large part of my life with an interest in conservation, and particularly in the last 22 years that I've been conducting monitoring of mallee fowl breeding in northwestern Victoria. And in that time, it has been given me the opportunity to spend time with some of the best people from Victoria and from around Australia, some of the best people that I've been able to spend time with in my life. So I want to start with an acknowledgement of country. I respectfully acknowledge the Yamatji people who are the traditional owners and first people of the country where Geraldton is located, the Nunagiri, Willanya, Nagaja, and my apologies for my pronunciations. I pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of the Yamatji peoples. I also pay my respects to the elders of the Bunurong people whose country lies to the east of Port Phillip Bay, where I'm speaking to you from today. To the Wadi people whose country straddles the Mayri River around Swan Hill and north to Boundary Bend, the area where I was born and grew up. To the people of northwestern Victoria, of the Wimmera River system, of northwestern Victoria from Dimboola in the south up to Pine Plains and Lake Tyrrell in the north, who were sometimes known as the Mallee Gonditch, the people of the Mallee, and to all of the First Peoples from across southern and central Australia who are the traditional owners and custodians of country where mallee fowl is found. And I should also pay my notes to, as Shona said, about asking for permission. I've actually, let's say I borrowed this photograph from the Yamatji Malpa Aboriginal Corporation. So thank you for that. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everybody who was there participating in the forum. I only wish that I and many of my colleagues could have come from Victoria and South Australia to be with you this year. As I said, I've been privileged to be involved with mallee fowl monitoring for the last 22 years. I've attended training weekends every year except one at Whipperfeld National Park with the Victorians up until last year. For me, it's the biggest time of year. I consider it to be mallee fowl Christmas, and it looks like we're going to have Christmas cancelled again this year, so I'm very sad about that. This is the first time since 2004 I've not been able to be at the conference in person, but we're there with you in spirit. And I want to emphasise the importance of what we are all doing, and to thank all of you and to everybody who's listening for your involvement in the Mallee Fowl Monitoring Project nationally. And to emphasise, you are contributing to one of the largest volunteer-supported scientific research and biodiversity conservation projects for a single species, not only in Australia, but in the world. And that's a fact that we need to keep clearly in our heads. I also want to, in this slide, if you'll indulge me, to recognise some people who are not with us anymore. All of these 5 people, and there are others who I could mention. We could talk about people who have not been involved in the Victorian Mallee Fowl Recovery Group, but ones like Angus Torpey, Keith Hately, Wimpy Reichelt, and the many people across the country that Joe spoke about yesterday. But all of the 5 people you see here, many of these faces you will recognise, some of you who've been involved for a few years. Anne and Peter Stokey, an absolutely extraordinary couple And I well remember in the 2004 forum when Anne would tell you that she could bring year 11 boys to tears with a reading of Macbeth. When you heard her talking about the monitoring program, which is now part of the national standard across the country, you would know why. She was the most spellbinding speaker. She was one of the strongest personalities and one of the best people I've ever got to meet. And with her was her husband, Peter, who unfortunately passed away in May 2019. Still makes me happy to think that he went to sleep with a glass of red wine by his bed and never woke up. The man in the middle there with a twinkle in his eye and a scheme in the back of his head, Bernie Fox, who always sent people an email the day before their birthday, but he had the date for mine wrong, which was lucky because he sent me an email to wish me a happy birthday on the 12th, and he died that afternoon. And if he hadn't sent it, I wouldn't have ever received it. Peter Sandell on the top right, who was for many years a mainstay in biodiversity conservation in Parks Victoria, was significant in getting us funding for the VMRG in many of our early years. And then later, when he left the department, came onto our committee and acted as vice president. And of course, at the bottom left, last but not least, Neil Mcfarlane in his happy place. He wasn't that happy about getting his photo taken, but that's my dad, who passed away in March this year. And he was the first president of BMRG and a very significant figure in conservation in Victoria and nationally with the Mallee Fowl groups. So this was the subject that I chose to talk about. This is something that has been in my mind for many years that I've been involved with the Mallee Fowl conservation. The topic is Mallee Fowl and the human factor, the place for icon species in research and conservation. And I want to ask the question, if it's important, if it's right that we should be focusing on a single species, does it distract from other biodiversity conservation, habitat protection and restoration priorities? Or is the fact that we can involve and gain so much community support for a single species help to protect not only that species, but the bush it will live in? So, as I said, I love the fact that I can get involved in Mallee Fowl conservation. One of the things that I love about it is the ability to spend time with groups of people like this, people with a shared purpose and a shared love of the bush and the birds that we're looking after. So this is a photograph taken at one of the VMRG's training weekends in Whitfeld. Would have been in the late 2000s. You can see Joe there holding court, and off to the right is our former president, Ron Wiseman. And of course, we haven't been able to meet in that way for the last couple of years. We've had to change the way that we're doing things. So this is a photo from one of our committee meetings earlier on this year, a screenshot that I took. So much the same way as I'm speaking to you now. So why are we here? Well, that's pretty easy. Special credit to Jessica Keem, who's not only an excellent researcher, she's an excellent photographer, as Zach will show. But this is the bird. We love this bird. Why do we love it? Well, why is it such an icon? It is an icon species. It is a species that everyone is very attached to, that everybody will do something to protect. And in doing the work that we can, in taking action to protect the Mallee fowl, we're also protecting Mallee, the bush that it's in, because it's a bird that needs a large amount of contiguous, healthy bushland around it to survive. It creates a space for the barking geckos and the Mallee mouse spiders and the other inhabitants of the environment that aren't quite as so sexy as that. But Mallee fowl isn't like the other icon species. It's not big and scary like a tiger or an elephant. And it's not cute and cuddly like a panda or a koala. But what it is, it's a survivor. It's so resilient. And as the son of a farmer, or a person who grew up in the Mallee itself, all of the farmers will talk about scratching a living off the land. And that's what the Mallee fowl does. And that's why the landholders, the community, everybody loves it. And that's important. It's important because the icon species can be a focus. and a rallying point for community support that can cut across different people's perspectives. So it binds us all together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, old and young, country and city. So one of the things that I've noticed about being involved in Mallee fowls since the late 90s to now is we've had all different ages. We do have a demographic issue with the age of our community, but the age of our members. But it's been so great to see so many younger people, so many young researchers, so many people working with the departments, working with the not-for-profit organisations, or simply coming out and providing the support to it. It's also been a real binding force where we've had people like myself living in the city of Melbourne or from Geelong who have been willing to travel up to the country. We've been able to connect with the landholders, with the local people from the areas in the bush with a common purpose. We've also got the support down the years from community, government and from business through mining companies like Iluka in Victoria and Mount Gibson in Western Australia, as we've been seeing. And particularly the landholders and the conservationists. It's a tool, it gives us a language to break down the barriers between the different groups involved in this. And I think I've mentioned the Indigenous ones as there. That's going to be a key and growing focus of the new recovery plan that we're working on at the moment, because we really need to increase our engagement with the Indigenous groups. I think we're seeing in Western Australia where you have people who are living out on country who've still got the knowledge about the right way for burning the land, for protecting the country. A lot of that knowledge we don't have over in the eastern states, certainly in Victoria to the same extent, but I think that it's something that we can promote, and it will be to the benefit of the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous people, and hopefully it will be to the benefit of the Mallee fowl and the Mallee as well. That photo, by the way, probably Joe's son Eli, who is pictured there with a Mallee fowl chick that was part of our DNA program in 2009. So Eli's probably about 20 odd now, and he probably won't be that impressed. But, once again, sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission, and I'm sure Joe will forgive me. Now, this is just to emphasise the point. We talk about the icon species thing. There is an anthropomorphic aspect to this. It's people responding to something that they think is cute and cuddly and warm, and they want to protect it, which is an anthropomorphic response. It's a human response, and we need to acknowledge that. And it's a positive and a powerful force, but it isn't all one way. The cuteness factor means that we start to be concerned about species in the environment, trying to protect them because we don't like to see cats being shot or cats being sprayed with poison because it makes us think of our little kitty at home. But cats don't belong in the bush, and horses don't belong in the national parks, nor do camels and goats or deer, which are a growing problem certainly in the eastern states, and haven't heard so much about that in Western Australia, but hopefully it's not the case there. It can also work against good environmental policy when we're talking about native species. So koalas are a case in point. They're rare in many places on the East Coast. They're threatened by land clearing and habitat loss, but it's not a universal picture. There are parts of Victoria where they're in near plague proportions, where overbrowsing damages native forest and eucalypt plantations, and at times they're eating themselves to the point of starvation. And organisations like WWF will run campaigns to raise money to support them. But in fact, because of the resistance to control measures, sometimes, sorry, I'm going to go back one. Sometimes we find ourselves forced to adopt expensive and ineffective or inefficient control measures, such as capturing injecting with contraceptives and then releasing them again, and then waiting for the population to fall through natural attrition or starvation. So I think that we need to establish a conservation ethic based on preservation of native species and natural ecosystems as the priority. In our fragmented and degraded environment, the first priority should be to preserve as many of the native species as possible in as near as possible to their native environments. Priority for non-native species in conservation areas should be population control up to and including complete removal by the most cost-effective, efficient and humane methods. And if it becomes necessary to manage overpopulation of native species, such as kangaroos or even koalas, we need to be prepared to consider and to defend the judicious use of the same measures. Which brings us back to these things. By protecting the Mallee fowl, we're also protecting the Mallee and all of the country where the Mallee fowl is found, the mulga, the salmon gum woodlands in Western Australia and wherever else they're found. This is a couple of beautiful photos. I've pinched the one from the salmon gum from BirdLife's website. The other one is one of my favourite photos from the VMRG's database, taken back in the late 90s with a film camera back in the day. It's from a nest in Menzies Flora and Fauna Reserve, which I'll refer back to later on. But, I mean, how great are Mallee fowl? I mean, I guess I'm amongst friends here, but don't we just love them? They hang out in the bush, they hardly make a sound, they never do anything to offend anyone. They work all year round, building and rebuilding a house to give their kids a good start in life, and then they kick them out to the world when they're of age. Sorry, I've got my slides out of order, but I hope there's somebody there who's jumped because they've got a spider one. That's a Mallee mouse spider, in case you didn't know. Okay. But in all seriousness, what I love about Mallee fowl is that everybody loves them. Everybody, including the bush cockies, who can appreciate a bird that can scratch a living off the land, that's as tough as they are. In wanting to protect the Mallee fowl, to let it have a bit of dirt to live off, we're also creating a space for the mouse spiders, the barking geckos, and the spider orchids, the things that are smaller and harder to see, but just as important. So I want to talk about some of the achievements of the National Mallee Fowl Monitoring Program. Now, a lot of what I've had to say is about Victoria because that's where I am and that's where I've had the experience. I've been fortunate to be part of developing the monitoring program over here and to see it being adopted and rolled out. And it's been so wonderful to see the same efforts, the same reactions from the community to see the monitoring program being implemented in Western Australia. It's fantastic to hear the names like Carl Danzy, who was involved in setting up the training and the monitoring going back more than 10 years ago, and who was at the 2007 conference in Katanning. To see Blair Parsons, who I remember as a young man, didn't have that much white in his beard back in the day when I didn't have this much white on the top of my head. But it's been a fantastic thing to be involved in this program over the last more than 2 decades that I've been in there. So let's talk about some of our achievements. It's a massive national volunteer-supported monitoring effort. As you saw, it's in excess of $150,000 as we estimate the in-kind contribution in Victoria alone. And if we add up all of the hours, the 2,000 hours that were spoken about this morning in Western Australia, and applied the same thing, the work that's done in South Australia as well. It is a tremendous effort that we're undertaking. There's a national monitoring methodology that's been adopted across all the states, to which we owe such a debt of gratitude to Joe and previously to his collaborator, Paul Burton, who developed that method. Joe's also been so instrumental in the development of the national database. The motion capture cameras, the programs that you've seen associated with the adaptive management predator experiment. The successes that we've had with engaging with stakeholders, whether they be state authorities, private landholders, miners, the natural resource management regions, such as the NAC that's running this program here, and the not-for-profit organisations. And it would be remiss of me in this if I didn't pay credit to the organisers of your forum that are over there, to Shona, to Jessica, who was involved earlier on, and particularly to Kane, who has only for me been a voice on the phone and a couple of photos this morning, who was obviously had to suffer the pain of the disruption to the planning of this because the eastern states dwellers like myself were not able to travel over there. I think it's important to talk about the Indigenous engagement that we've had. There have been some fantastic examples of that going on in Western Australia. The engagements that have happened back from when Joe was working out of Alice Springs and doing his work both with the Mallee fowl and the Icharachari, the marsupial mole in northern South Australia with the Untitled Chapter people, the API lands up there. So I think those things have been extremely important for understanding the breadth of Mallee fowl across the country and also in building the community links across the country. I've also made reference to, unfortunately, I didn't myself get to go along, but in Mallee Cliffs National Park, across the Murray River from Robinvale in New South Wales, between Robinvale and Mildura, some of our VMRG members, particularly Tom and Ronnie O'Donnell, were involved in organising some excellent programs up there that were engaging the Indigenous youth in that part of southern New South Wales. And those are areas that I'm firmly of the belief that we can and we must and we will promote over the next 10 years of the next Mallee fowl recovery plan. So within those achievements, I want to focus on a couple of specific ones. And first and foremost amongst these is the National Mallee Fowl Monitoring Program. As I said before, this is one of the largest volunteer-supported scientific research and biodiversity conservation projects for a single species, not only in Australia, but the world. That's been said to us by people, researchers from around the world who've come to some of the fora that we've run going back in previous years, whether it be Mildura in 2018 or Dubbo in 2014 or earlier on in Renmark, Katanning, and then the first one that I attended in 2004. We must remember what we're doing here is incredibly significant in Australian terms and in world terms. From its origins with Joe in the 1980s when he did his PhD working for the department, it has produced a data set that now stretches well past 30 years. It covers the full breadth of Australia from central New South Wales right across to the far western edge of the continent, covering 4 states. And one of these days, I'm sure we'll find that there's still a bird or two up in the territory as well. It's a consistent, reproducible data set that will be a resource to researchers for decades and centuries to come. It is a resource now, and it will continue to be in ways that I don't think we yet fully understand. One of the things that I have said a few times down the years is every year we take a photograph from the same location in the bush with the same bit of bushland behind it. And for any bright young student that's out there looking for their next PhD, if you've got an interest in vegetation, then there is a 30-year data set of changes to the vegetation around the nest, marked down to the exact locations of the GPS within metres in the bush. Just that, to me, represents a significant piece of information. The information that was gained from the analysis of Mallee scat collected on BMRG mounds over about a 15-year period was conducted by Barbara Trigg going back 6 or 7 years ago when she was doing her work nationally on the diet of foxes, cats and wild dogs, which showed that species like Ngari were still present in the Mallee when it wasn't known if they were there or not. It is an achievement of which we can all be proud, and it is one that we must sustain. It has been fantastic to see the ongoing effort that the whole group, that the Mallee fowl community right across the country has continued to contribute to this. Sometimes you may not, as you stagger through the bush or fight your way through the broom bush, you may not actually see the context of the work that you're doing in the national and international picture, but be aware of it and be proud of it. The second one that I want to highlight is the adaptive management predator experiment. It is an incredible undertaking. We're testing a research question over 5 years, over 40 paired sites across 4 states. We are conducting a biodiversity experiment, a scientific research experiment on a continental scale. It's something that has never been attempted before. It is not without risk because it might ultimately deliver a null result. We might end up not really being sure if fox control, if baiting for predators actually is important in terms of the long-term preservation of Mallee fowl, because as we've heard today, there are so many factors that play into this. The competition from herbivores, competition or the impacts of fire, the fact that Mallee fowl live so long that we may be measuring a stable population from the adult birds that are still there, but if we're not seeing recruitment into the population in 10 and 15 years to come, we'll see a slow decline. It's one of the fears that ecologists face around the world in so many places with trying to manage human impacts on the environment. But that's just the scientific method. If we didn't do this, we would not know, and we'd still be guessing, and we might still be investing. I mean, we saw yesterday that something like $130,000 has been invested in the trial of the Felixer units, and at the end of the day, it's killed 4 cats. So we face many challenges with conservation of Mallee fowl and with conservation in general. For Mallee fowl face the challenges of competing land use priorities, whether it's for mining, whether it's for clearing, for land for grazing, or the use of existing land uses for grazing or other purposes. We face the challenges of competing political priorities. For example, the security of funding. As you've heard yesterday, the funding has ceased now for the academics side of the adaptive management predator experiment. And the fact that in so many places and in so many ways, work can be started and then not seen through to the end because priorities for allocation of funding change from year on year. We face the challenge of borders, and not just because in this time of COVID, we in the eastern states aren't able to travel to the west. The borders play into land use priorities, they play into planning. We see that, I think the best way to sum this up, we saw the photo earlier on of Anne Stokey. Anne and Peter, Joe arranged, going back into the late 2000s, for Anne and Peter to go up and work with the people in the APY lands to teach them about the monitoring programs that we did. And obviously they learned a great deal from the traditional owners while they were there. And I recall Anne telling one of her stories about how she was saying that the differences in the land use regimes and the structure of the departments on one side of the Western Australian and South Australian border to the other were impacting on the ability to get consistent policy, consistent approaches to managing mallee fowl. And it's true, of course, the differences between Victoria, South Australia and New South Wales. But as Anne told this story, she said one of the ladies that she was sitting in the circle with and talking to pointed at the map, pointed at the line that Anne was picking out and said, "Younga mudder, he don't see that." Some of the other challenges we face, the demographics of community groups. As I said, it's been a concern for me going back for as long as I've been involved with the VMRG, that most of our members were getting on in years and they've continued to. As I highlighted, a number of our really most important senior members have died and others have reached the age when they've said, hey, we can't do as much as we did anymore. For many years that I've been involved in the committee with the VMRG, from 2002, for probably the first 10 years, in all but about 1 or 2 years, I was the youngest person on the committee and I was in my late 30s when I started. So that is a challenge that we face. And as I said, to see the younger people here involved in this has been really positive. And if I can slip a quiet plug in there, if you find yourselves at a stage of life when you've got a different job or your priorities in life from change for a period in time where you're forming relationships and having families and stuff like that, well, you can always be like I did and do that for a few years and then come back to this, because once it's in your blood, it never quite goes away. And of course, there are some real significant challenges in the environment itself. Fire regimes is one that has come up quite on repeated occasions through this discussion. It has come up on repeated occasions in the forums that I've attended going back to 2004. It is an area that I think we have a great potential to learn from the Indigenous groups, from the people who are still living out on country, particularly in Western Australia and South Australia, because I think we can learn how to, the right way to burn country, the right way to protect the country, because the alternative is, and I have to explain that since 2002, the site that I've been monitoring is called Bronzewing Flora and Fauna Reserve, which is about 20 kilometres south of Oyen in northwestern Victoria. And in January 2014, 85% of that reserve of 16,000 hectares was burnt in a major landscape fire, which also caused significant damage to Whipperfell National Park and to Paradise Flora and Fauna Reserve. So we need to find better ways to manage fire in the environment. The weeds and feral pests, as we've heard, the weeds such as buffalo grass, increasing the fire risk as well as competing with the native species. And the feral pests, whether they be the herbivores like goats, deer, rabbits and the rest, or the foxes and cats. And last but not least, climate change, which we know is the Damoclean sword that hangs over all of the environments that we, everything to do with the world that we live in. But in spite of all of these, I think there are reasons for hope. I think there are reasons to be optimistic, and I think we've heard some of those in the discussion today. If you'll excuse me, I'm just trying to find my... there are reasons to be optimistic. One of the most important of those that I've spoken about has been the community support that we have seen across the country. Another one which has come up a number of times in the discussion has been habitat protection. Has been the establishment of new public and private conservation reserves, the covenanting, revegetation, predator and feral pest control taking place. we heard about the Jeff Armstrong property, which has been used to set up the funds for that Liz spoke about yesterday. That property was set up and covenanted by Jeff before his death, and has now been purchased by Michael and Louise. Michael, you saw speaking yesterday. Of all of the gifts that we received from Jeff with the Armstrong bequest, perhaps one of the greatest and most long-lasting gifts that we will get has been the involvement of Michael and Louise for the VMRG, because they are just wonderful people. I've thrown this photo in at the last minute. It's a photo of a Mallee fowl mound on a property that was owned and is still owned by Sue Heyman, along with her late husband, Bernie Fox, who you see pictured there. This was a site that they revegetated at Yannick, which is between the Big Desert and Little Desert. And that's a Mallee fowl mound that's been established in the areas that they revegetated on site. And last but not least, I want to talk about 3 areas that are very close to my heart. This is the areas called Wondown, Menzies and O'Breeze. So Wondown was surveyed by the Mid-Murray Field Naturalists in the late 1960s and 1969, including my dad and my family. It's if you can see my mouse on the screen, the larger of these 2 blocks is Wondown. This block down here was originally the Birkinshaw property. It's been added to Wondown and is being revegetated over time. Coolanong is where I went to school, and just down here at the bottom of what was called the Meridian Road, which was that straight line that was in the transect that Jessica Keane showed in the map that she was talking about yesterday. That was the western boundary of the property where I grew up. So Wondown was surveyed and it was purchased by a philanthropic trust in the early 1970s, the M.A. Ingram Trust. This area just to the east of it is called the Menzies Nature Conservation Reserve. Menzies family were ones I went to school with, and it was part of the property that they owned that they then have covenanted off. And this area at Boundary Bend, which includes some box country and lignin country, and also some Mallee country down here where we have one of our monitoring sites, the VMRG, was purchased from a man called Franco Breed by a man called Neil Mcfarlane by my father in the 1980s. And when Dad had to sell up, Trust for Nature later on in the 90s were able to buy the uncleared areas of this block and turn it into reserves. Now these 3 areas have the highest breeding density of Mallee fowl of all the sites that we monitor in Victoria, and they are all part of, as you can see here, I've taken this shot from BirdLife International's register of important bird areas. So they are listed internationally as an important bird area. And all of them came to be because of the purchase of private land and protection for the future. So I'm coming to the end. I know I'm kind of about to run over time. So can we advance this trend? That's one of the challenges that I think that comes out of this, and we have seen many examples with the work that Bush Heritage, Trust for Nature, as I've mentioned, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy are doing, and also that private individuals have been able to do in smaller scale. To do this, to get the full value out of this, we need to identify priority areas, opportunities, and when we find areas where land becomes available in strategic places, to link those opportunities to philanthropic trusts, not-for-profits or committed private individuals, so that we can continue to link habitat patches into a network of an ever-growing meta-habitat, something like a neural network that we've built through the community of Mallee fowl supporters from all across the country. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful presentation from Ross. Thank you, Ross.